All of the doctors were seen on the edge of town, practicing a strange demonic ritual. Welcome to Night Vale.
Just kidding, don't sue me. This is not your inspiration, the podcast where I ramble about disability. My name is Gray, I'm the host of this shit show, and today I want to talk about the trauma of doctors and the trauma of being sick, because I feel like that is something that is often looked over and not talked about. The emotional impact of that kind of stuff. And I also want to dive into some of the huge gaping flaws in the medical system, such as doctors not believing patients, medical treatment being just too expensive to access, all sorts of that kind of juicy stuff. Quick warning, I am rather medicated today, so if this is a rambly, incoherent podcast and you're thinking to yourself, what the fuck are they talking about? It's not me, it's all of the medication that I'm on. Anyway, that being said, let's jump into it. So I kind of want to start just by talking about how scary it can be to be sick, chronically ill, and disabled. And I think chronically ill and disabled can go together a lot of the times. There are a lot of charities, for example, that try to make the hospital a more comfortable place for children. Charities that will make blankets for children or like hats and cute port covers for kids going through chemo. There are a lot of charities like that. There are none for adults. And the thing is, the hospital doesn't stop being a scary place when you turn 18. It's not like you turn 18 and all of a sudden being in the ICU is, totally fine and not scary at all. It doesn't matter if you've been sick for 1 year or since you've been born. It doesn't matter if you're 7 years old or 27 years old. The hospital and just the institution of sickness is always scary. Every time you're alone in a hospital room with beeping machines and doctors and nurses coming in and out and you don't know what's going on, that's scary. And every time a doctor walks in with a flock of residents and interns and fellows following behind them, asking you the same questions over and over again and talking over you like you're just a case file to them, that's scary. Late nights alone in sterile-smelling hospital rooms with scratchy hospital blankets and maybe some wilting flowers in the corner that a friend got you. It's scary every single time. It doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter how experienced you are. It's always threatening. It's always traumatic. Every claustrophobic MRI machine, every time you feel the warmth and burning metallic-y taste of contrast dye going into you when you get a CT scan. Every painful blood draw or painful biopsy. Every time they take you back into a freezing cold OR and lay you on a table and put the mask over your face and tell you to count back from 10 before a surgery. Every time you wake up from that surgery alone and confused in a recovery room. Every IV or PICC line or port, every NG tube or J tube, every aspect of being sick is threatening. And I don't think people talk about that. And I don't think people really ever acknowledge that. A lot of times we're expected to put on a brave face, expected to pretend that it's all okay, that it doesn't hurt, that it's not horrifying. But it is. I recently had a surgery on my back, and it went really wrong. It was fucked up, but before we knew that it had gone really wrong, I was waiting to go back into surgery, and I was with my mom. And this is not new to us. We're not new to this rodeo. We've been there a million times in the same hospital, in the same pre-op room, waiting to go back with the same surgeon. And every time I'm scared. And it's not like I haven't had 1.5 million surgeries before, but every time I know what it's going to be like. And I didn't know how to explain that to my mom, who was sitting on her laptop doing work, just kind of waiting for it to be over so that she could go back to be productive. And my mom is not a cold person. My mom is a very loving person. And it's not that she wasn't worried about her kid, of course she was. It's just that she was so used to this routine that it wasn't shocking to her anymore. It wasn't new. And it wasn't new or shocking to me either. I knew exactly what to expect, but it was still scary. And of course, there's the other aspect of trauma that has nothing to do with the fear of actual medical procedures, but has to do with the actual doctors themselves. That's the fact that so often doctors don't believe people, that they doubt us. It's the way that doctors talk down to people and think that we don't know our own bodies. And of course, there are so many different intersections to that. It's that much harder if you don't have the money, or if you are not white, or not straight, or not cis, or if you're disabled and undiagnosed. There are so many aspects that make already threatening doctor's offices even more terrifying spaces. I don't know one single person who does not have a story of a doctor not believing them. Not one. And I've talked to a lot of people about this. It's a pretty common topic. But the stories that you hear over and over again are not, my doctor was great and he believed everything I said. The stories that you hear over and over again are, this doctor's appointment was a shit show. I feel horrible about myself. I'm crying in this hospital parking lot. My doctor didn't believe me. They're not productive appointments. They're not comforting medical professionals. So often, it's people who think they know your own body better than you. It's people discounting your experiences because you don't have an MD after your name. It's specialists that don't take your insurance so you can't even get in to see them. And it's specialists that once you do get in to see them, tell you it's all in your head and you're crazy. I was talking with one doctor who I really like, we're pretty close. And he sees a lot of people and diagnoses a lot of people who have spent years trying and failing to get a diagnosis or to get the adequate treatment from other doctors. And he said to me that he doesn't know one person who doesn't show at least a few signs of PTSD from their experiences with not being believed by other doctors. And that really struck me because it's one thing to hear it from me, a bitter, angry, disabled person who is anti-doctor. But it's another thing to hear it from an actual doctor who does this for a living. It's ironic. I was going to have a guest on this podcast, and the person who I was going to have chose to not do it for the sake of anonymity. But I got their permission to tell this story if I removed the names and diagnoses. This person spent 5 years really on the brink of death, with no diagnosis, but genuinely dying. And after 5 years, they finally went to a clinic and got a diagnosis. And after a year of adequate treatment, they were completely asymptomatic. Whereas a year prior to that, they had been on their deathbed. And they wouldn't have been if doctors had listened to them and listened to their symptoms. They would have been fine. They would have gotten the treatment that they needed, and it wouldn't have been a problem. But they didn't. And there's no good reason that they didn't get the treatment other than their doctors didn't believe them. They didn't believe the very tangible, visible symptoms that they were showing. And this is someone who did have tangible, visible symptoms, let alone everyone else who doesn't have tangible, visible symptoms, but has symptoms like pain or heart palpitations or something that isn't visible on a lab test. It's impossible. And once you're diagnosed, it's not impossible, but it doesn't just go away once you have a perfect name for all of your symptoms. You still have to fight for treatment. You still have to fight for the meds you need. I know people who are spending $300 a month on meds and people who are spending $4,000 a month on meds. You can be in the hospital with a great doctor, but the attending on that floor in the middle of the night might have no idea the names of your conditions or the names of the meds that you're on, and you still have to explain it to that attending doctor. We never stop having to advocate for ourselves. In the medical world, it is always a fight, and it is a dangerous fight. It's a fight that if you don't fight, you could not get the proper treatment. In some cases, you could die. And it's a fight that we shouldn't have to fight. We shouldn't have to fight our doctors. We shouldn't have to advocate ourselves in the aggressive, hard way that we have to. Our doctors should be people that we trust, people that we can go to for help. People who we can look at and say, hey, I'm having this symptom. And they say back to us, that's strange, but I'm going to do everything I can to figure it out. But real life is not an episode of Grey's Anatomy or House MD. Doctors don't stay up all night working themselves into oblivion to answer strange medical questions. If a doctor doesn't know the answer, more often than not, they'll say there is no answer because we're faking it. That shocked me when I first got sick. I was expecting life to be a medical drama, with doctors working themselves into insanity and going on these crazy adventures to answer life's toughest medical questions. I was not expecting doctors to sit with me for 10 minutes and say that I needed to be in a psych ward because I was having heart problems. A story that I have that kind of goes into this point of us having to educate our doctors and teach our doctors is, and I just want to say, quick TMI, if you don't want to hear about medical details, this isn't too gory, but I just want to put that out there. I had some wounds on my feet, like some ulcers kind of, and I went to go see my doctor about them, and before the main doctor came in, he had one of his residents come in. And the resident came in and he took one look at me, and the first thing he said was, "Oh shit, that's bad," out loud to me. And I kind of laughed it off and I said, yeah, that's why I'm here. And he said, "Would you mind if I took a picture of it for educational purposes?" And I had no clue how to respond to that, but being, just the courteous, education advocate that I am, I said, okay. And sure enough, this guy whips out his iPhone and takes a picture of my feet and he leaves the room. And I know it's weird, but I'm not really thinking about it. And my main doctor comes in and we discuss it and blah, blah, blah. And I'm on my way to leave. And I see this resident who came in at the beginning of the appointment and took the picture, standing with a group of young-looking people who look to be about my age. And they're all standing, I'm assuming these people are other residents, and they're looking at his phone and they're giggling. And this guy points in kind of a secretive way and he says, "That's her." And I realize that the picture they're looking at on his phone is a picture of my feet. And they're laughing at it. They're not getting educated. They're laughing at it. And by the way, him pointing at me and saying that's her is totally illegal when it comes to HIPAA laws and confidentiality laws. You're not really supposed to be able to identify the patient. In that moment, I felt so violated and betrayed because this doctor saw the grossest, most vulnerable part of me, and I let him take a picture of it for quote-unquote educational purposes, and he used that to have a quick laugh with his friends before going to have lunch at the Dunkin' Donuts downstairs. That shouldn't be okay. I don't think it's okay in anyone's mind, and yet it happened, and there was nothing I could do about it. I let him take the picture. And the reason I let him take the picture is not because I particularly liked this guy, but because I so badly want to hope that the next generation of doctors is not as bad as the current generation of doctors. Because the current generation of doctors are like the cops of medicine, and I'm very anti-cops. Anyway, that being said, my point is, I think disabled people, chronically ill people, are teachers in almost every aspect of our lives. And whether it's a doctor taking pictures of us, or someone asking us invasive questions on the street, we are expected to share our stories. And even when we're not expected to, sometimes we have to. Sometimes we have to because if we don't, a doctor is going to give us the wrong treatment and it'll be dangerous. Or we have to because someone who is much bigger than us and much more able-bodied than us is asking us an invasive question in a bar, and we don't want to start anything. Even if it's saying to someone, that's an inappropriate question and here's why, that's still educating them. It's still educating them on why it's an inappropriate question. How many times has someone asked you on the street if you're visibly disabled, why do you use that mobility aid? Or why do you walk like that? Why do you talk like that? Why do you do this or do that? What's wrong with you? How many times have you given them a straight answer? Or how many times have you said to them, that's an inappropriate question, and here's why? People feel entitled to education by disabled people. And yet at the same time, while they're sitting there feeling entitled to education, they also don't respect us, and they don't respect our experiences. It's almost like they want us to share our experiences or put us in a situation where we have to share our experiences, and then they go and they mock those experiences. And they say those experiences aren't real. They're not valid. And it's ironic and in a horribly annoying and unfair way. This is kind of a sidetrack, but kind of not. Someone asked me recently, what do you do when kids come up to you and they ask you questions about your disability, like in public, kids you don't know? And I had to really, really think about it. I didn't even answer this person's question because I didn't know my answer. Because what I personally do is not necessarily the right thing. I'm not the hugest fan of kids, not like that I mean to random kids I meet on the street, just in the sense that I don't want my own kids. But when kids ask me, why do you use a wheelchair? I usually say, it just helps me move around better. Or if a kid asks, what's wrong with you? I say, nothing's wrong with me. And the reason that I say that is not because, I'm just so excited to open up about my disability, but because unlike the adults that are asking or the doctors that are asking, kids are asking out of a genuine curiosity. And I feel like answering makes this impression that, maybe it is okay to talk about disability. And maybe this isn't the best way to do it, but it's okay to talk about. That being said, it's not my job to educate your kids. It's the parents' job to educate their kids. I realize that parents aren't doing that. Parents don't talk to their kids about disability. They don't tell their kids, hey, some people are disabled and that's okay. And here's how to interact with them. And here's what not to do. Parents don't have those conversations with their kids. And so therefore, the responsibility falls on us to have those conversations with kids. And while kids don't mean it in the same malicious, entitled way that adults do, it's still not our job to educate other people's kids. Whether we do it or not, we shouldn't have to do it. If someone makes the choice to educate a kid, then that's great. But we shouldn't be put in a position where it falls on us automatically. And I feel like so much of everything, doctors who don't believe us, and kids who ask us questions on the street, and adults who ask us, hey, can you have sex? I feel like so much of it comes from this society that doesn't talk about disability, that refuses to acknowledge it, that keeps it hush-hush and sweeps it under the rug, that says, I don't see disability, I see different ability, or I see handy-capable people. It comes from the society that refuses to acknowledge that some people are sick, some people are disabled, and that's okay. And the results of that are huge, and there are more results of that kind of toxic mentality than I could possibly name in a 20-minute podcast. I think it leads to doctors refusing people mobility aids when they really need them. It leads to doctors pushing us so far past our limits that we're injured in the process. It leads to kids coming up to us and asking us on the street what's wrong with us. And it leads to adults coming up to us on the street and asking us what's wrong with us. It leads to adults assuming that we can't think or we can't have sex or whatever it is that they think. And in my opinion, it all comes back to this idea that disability is a bad and gross and shameful thing, and no one can talk about it. Doctors in med school can't talk about it, and people can't talk about it with their kids. No one can talk about it. I think that's the mentality that is so prevalent in our society. And that mentality is toxic and it's bullshit. Disability is not a bad thing. The negative aspects of disability, more often than not, come from other people and society. Disability isn't some awful plague. It is not some curse that if you talk about it, then you'll wake up tomorrow unable to walk. It just is. It's a body type. It's an identity, whatever you want to call it. But the thing it's not is this, thing where if you talk about it, you're forever cursed. And that mindset, I think, is so deeply rooted into our society that it leads to some, besides annoying things when you're at the mall, it leads to like egregious medical neglect. And that's a problem. If no one else is going to talk about disability, at least doctors in medical school need to be able to. And I think right now they're not. Right now they look at someone who might look young and they say, no, this person cannot be disabled. I won't let them be disabled. And it leads to things like misdiagnosis or improper medical treatment. And that's hugely problematic. And that's, of course, on top of the actual fear and anxiety that goes into medical testing, and every new med that you know is going to have side effects, and every blood draw that you know is going to leave a huge bruise on your arm, every biopsy, every test you don't know the answer to, every claustrophobic MRI, everything. This problem with doctors, this personal, human, societal problem with doctors, is on top of the unpleasantness of the entire medical system. Even if the medical system is working at its best, like never been better, it's still awful, right? If we think, okay, maybe the medical system is designed for like a straight white man with lots of money to spare who's relatively healthy and maybe has one or two common health problems. If we think, okay, that's who this system is designed for, it's still going to be awful for that person. It's still an uncomfortable system, let alone this huge societal problem with doctors. I often ramble a lot about, how little representation of disability we see in Hollywood. How everyone we see in Hollywood is able-bodied and most of the time white and straight. But how often do we see disabled doctors? When's the last time you had a disabled surgeon or a chronically ill neurologist? We almost never have doctors who are like us. In my experience, I've never had a chronically ill or disabled doctor before. So how can they possibly understand what life is like for us if they themselves have never experienced it outside of a textbook that they studied? Yeah, representation in media is important, but representation in a doctor's office? That would be life-changing. That would be life-saving. And we don't have that right now. And I've never been to med school. I don't know the inner workings of the system. I don't know how to make that happen. But imagine having an honest conversation with a chronically ill doctor, or having an honest conversation with a gay doctor or a trans doctor. It would be so different than having a fight with a doctor who doesn't get it, who will never get it. And of course, I'm not saying all doctors are evil, but I'm saying there's a problem with the system. And also, I probably should have said this in the beginning, this is my own personal opinion, nurses are saints. Any negative experience that I've ever had with a nurse is not because that person is a bad nurse, it's because they're overworked and they're working within a system. Nurses are going so hard for their patients. They are on another level. And if there are any nurses listening to this podcast, none of this applies to you. You guys are great. Keep it up. Like, I am pro-nurse, anti-doctor, but pro-nurse. Anyway, where was I? This is what I do. I sidetrack myself. But I think when you talk to disabled people and chronically ill people, and every single one you talk to has at least one or two stories, horror stories, of hospital stays or doctor's visits, that's when you know this is a huge, huge systemic problem. It's not one that I know how to solve, but it's also one that isn't talked about outside of the disability and chronically ill communities, and it needs to be. This is a problem that could affect anyone. Anyone could wake up tomorrow with strange symptoms that they don't know how to explain, and they could be in our shoes. Any single person. And healthy, able-bodied people I don't even know if they know that this is a problem, if they know that this problem exists, but they should. This is an isolated thing, and it shouldn't be. It's wrong that it is. I think a lot of disability activism is very isolated. It's only within our community that we talk about these things. Other people really don't. And of course that's a problem. And it's a problem because, well, it's a problem for obvious reasons, because people need to be talking about this stuff, because disability is like the largest minority in the world. But it's also a problem because anyone could wake up tomorrow and be disabled. And I think that scares people. I think people don't want to think that they could wake up tomorrow unable to see, or unable to walk, or in a ton of pain. And I think that is kind of part of the reason why they tell us, well, just try yoga, or just try vitamins, is it's this illusion of control. They think, well, that person is disabled because they must have done something wrong, and therefore, because I am doing everything right, I can never be disabled. And of course, that's such a flawed, horrible way of thinking, but I'd argue that that's a lot of the reason why people give so much of the unasked for advice that they give. That doesn't have to do with doctors. That's me going off on a tangent because I'm annoyed that people tell me to try eating kale to cure crippling genetic illness. My point is, there's something wrong in the medical system. I don't know what it is. I only know the side effects of it. And the side effects of it are that doctors are terrifying, and doctors can be dangerous. It's a problem that we really need to address. And another thing that needs to be addressed is the mental implications of being sick. We all know the physical implications, but we need to be able to talk about the fear and the anxiety and the depression and the trauma of being disabled, becoming sick. We need to be able to talk about that openly and honestly without people saying, oh, well, therefore your illness must all be in your head. We need to be able to talk about our mental illnesses and even just our normal fears and anxieties and sadness without people immediately saying, well, that's why you're disabled. And right now, I don't think we're in a place where we can do that. And we need to get to that place. And on that note, I'm going to say I will talk to you next Monday. And as always, take care of yourselves.